With Warframe's recent Jade Shadows update, Ember received a rework that made her much stronger. And while she's a very formidable frame indeed now, she does have a problem that I haven't seen anyone talking about. So, in this Warframe guide, we're not only going to talk about what Ember can do and how to mod her really strong, but also what that problem is and why it might even make her completely irrelevant in some eyes. As always, big shoutouts to all generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. You know me, you know my guide, so let's first take a look at our skills because they're nice. Yes, that was kinda cringe. However, what is not cringe is her passive because that gives you 5% more ability strength for every enemy that is affected by heat in a 50-meter radius around you. This is really great and Ember can make a good use of it because, all her abilities revolve around burning down enemies, so meeting that requirement shouldn't be that much of an issue. Embers 1, Fireball, is very straightforward. You shoot out a fireball that deals heat damage, inflicts heat status effect, and has a 3-meter radius if I'm not mistaken. And while the damage here is not that impressive, if you shoot out a lot of fireballs in rapid succession, then you can chain a combo of fireballs that can increase the damage by up to 8 times. In all honesty, even at the highest combo counter with the most ideal situation, the damage of Fireball isn't all that impressive, and I wouldn't suggest using this for damage dealing in Steel Path. It just isn't up to speed. Fireball does have an augment though that gives you heat infusion on your weapon, which is pretty cool. Your weapon will deal more damage, and this heat infusion can also combine with whatever element you have on the weapon, so you might open up a mod slot on whatever gun you're choosing. But all in all, if you wanted to use a helmet ability on Ember, then I would suggest putting that in the first slot because Fireball is the most expendable one. Ability number 2, Immolation. When you cast the ability, you get this heat meter on the bottom of your screen. Next to the heat meter, there is a certain percentage value, and that is how much damage reduction Ember gets while her second skill is active. This one, at maximum meter, can go up to a maximum of 90% damage reduction, which is quite a lot. However, there is a bit more to that heat meter, so let's take a quick look at that. See, by casting her first ability Fireball, or her fourth ability that we're gonna get into in a minute here, you can make the heat of that meter increase more and more quickly. Once it has reached the maximum limit, meaning you have the maximum damage reduction, the heat meter is gonna start draining your energy over time, and the longer it stays at this maximum level, the faster you will lose energy. And what makes it even worse is, this one is uncapped, so if you constantly have that heat meter at maximum, at some point you will start losing energy so fast that there's no chance on Earth you would ever be able to counteract that. So, long story short, you need to make sure that after some time at maximum heat meter, you kind of take down the heat level a little bit, just to make sure that the energy drain will stay in check. Immolation also has an augment that gives damage reduction to your nearby teammates, so if you're in a team and you want to support them, that might be worth looking at, but otherwise this is a definite skip. Now, let's take a look at her third ability, Fireblast. Remember how I just said that you don't want to have the Immolation meter at the maximum all the time? Well, Fireblast is going to be your tool of choice to resolve that issue. Whenever you cast Fireblast, you will deal heat damage in an AoE around you, and by casting Fireblast, you will reduce the Immolation meter, so if you feel that you've been at maximum for too long and the energy drain starts becoming too powerful, just quickly cast your Fireblast, and therefore your energy problem will be resolved. Now, of course, Fireblast does not only resolve your issues with the meter, but it also armor strips enemies around you at maximum Immolation meter even fully. So yeah, all in all, if you want to play Ember, Fireblast is a definite must, and the AoE armor strip, of course, is a nice side effect. Fireblast also has 2 augments, the first one being Purifying Flames, which gives you and your allies status immunity for some time after casting it. It's kinda okay-ish, but I don't think it's that much needed. However, the Healing Flame augment, oh boy, this one is an absolute must if playing Ember. When you use this augment, each enemy hit by Fireblast will heal up a decent chunk of your health, and if you heal more than you actually need to be healed, that overheal will also be turned into overguard for Ember. This, all in all, is a really nice synergy because remember, the damage reduction that you have comes from the Immolation meter being at the maximum, and when you cast Fireblast, that temporarily goes down again. So in that time frame where you're not at maximum damage reduction anymore, then the Overguard will be present and protect you until the meter has filled up again, where then the damage reduction will take over again. And last but definitely not least, Ember's big bada boom ultimate called Inferno. Casting this ability is completely free, and what it will do is it will rain down meteorites onto all the enemies that are currently on screen. The important part here is enemies on screen, so it's not a radial AoE, it's a cone in front of you of just what is visible. Those meteorites will deal some impact and heat damage, which is nice, but all in all, not that strong when compared to other Nukin abilities. But the cool part is, it will surround the affected enemies with a heat ring, and when those enemies get close to other enemies that are not affected, that heat effect will jump over and therefore can spread in the entire room, kind of a bit similar to Saren's spores if you want to make that connection there. As for the energy cost, I just said casting the ability is free, and that is true, but you will lose 10 energy for every meteorite that comes down, so for every enemy that is affected. However, if there are more than 10 enemies on screen, you will get more than 10 meteorites, but still only pay a maximum of 100 energy. So yeah, all in all, the role of Inferno is to deal some damage, spread heat basically in the entire room by the enemies running around like headless chickens and quote-unquote infecting more enemies with the heat effect, and most importantly, Inferno will massively increase the rate at which you gain heat for the heat meter, so if you cast that regularly and then you use Fireblast to bring the meter down, the rate at which you gain that heat back up again to the maximum should be so fast that you basically have no downtime with your heat meter. Inferno also has an augment called Exothermic, which makes it that when enemies are killed while under the effect of that fire ring, they have a 15% chance to drop an energy orb. However, in my testing, this was kind of a bit underwhelming and not that consistent, so if you ask me, this is not really worth the mod slot. Alright, so much for the skills, and I think that whole thing with the Immolation meter going up and down and which skills to use for what situation might have been a bit complicated, so let's take a minute to talk about how you actually want to play Ember in practice, and you will see it's actually pretty simple. First off, you want to have her 2 Immolation on all the time to get the damage reduction. Then you want to make sure that you regularly cast her 4 to keep that up all the time and have a lot of enemies affected by this heat effect. And whenever you feel like you need an armor strip or you feel that the energy drain from the Immolation meter is becoming too punishing, then you will cast Fireblast to quickly reset it, and if you've casted your 4 often enough, you will see the heat meter will fill up to the maximum really quickly so that you get your 90% damage reduction. And when it comes to damage dealing, well, in Steel Path, her abilities are not that strong, so you will have to rely on a weapon, but here you can freely choose whatever you like. Ember synergizes nicely with pretty much every arsenal out there. And as always, if you could spare a like for the guide, that would be nice, because it helps big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. And now, let's finally get into the build. And starting out here, I want with the helmet ability choices that you can use on Ember that might synergize well with her. First of all, since the majority of her damage output will come from your weapons, any Warframe ability that helps with weapon damage is always welcome. Then, in case you're having struggle with your energy economy or you just want to weave in some viral effects, of course, Grendel's Nourish, always the latest and greatest. But since her fireballs and also the effect of her 4 kind of have a bit of an AoE, you could also make use of a grouping ability, pile up all the enemies in one spot and then rain down havoc from above. This is really fun, but you also see on screen, the damage is not as strong as something like Protea, for example. But yeah, which helmet ability, by the way, would you suggest? Leave us your ideas in the comments down below. Up next, and before we go into the build itself, let's also take a quick look at her Archon shards that I used, and this one is also pretty straightforward. Like I do on most frames nowadays, I went for 3 blue Archon shards to increase maximum energy, so that puts us in a safe energy situation. And in addition to that, because I wanted to play her with my dual Toxicist Incarnon, I went for 2 Tau Forged Orange shards to increase the crit chance of my secondary weapon. But of course, this is just subjectively nice for me. If you wanted to use anything else in those 2 slots, you could definitely go and do that. As for the main build, I went for a healthy mix of strength, range, and duration, with growing power in the aura, Umbral Intensify, transient fortitude, and power drift taking care of my ability strength. Remember, with her passive, you get additional ability strength just from having heated up enemies around you. Then adaptation, because it combines really nicely with her innate 90% damage reduction, so you become really tanky. Prime continuity for the duration, stretch for the range, healing flame as the nice augment for her 3, which you definitely should also use. Fireball Frenzy, because I wanted to use Fireball to infuse my weapons with heat damage. And finally, Archon Vitality, not only to double the heat status effects from my abilities, but in this case also because having at least a bit of health will go a long way in making your Ember more survivable. In order to not run out of energy, I used Arcane Energize, but if you don't have that, you could also always throw out one mod, for example Fireball Frenzy here, and replace it with Equilibrium. That will do perfectly fine for your energy economy then. And in the second Arcane slot, you're pretty much free to use whatever you like. I went for Arcane Precision to make my secondary weapon, my dual Toxicist that I'm using here, even stronger in terms of damage, but you're free to do whatever you want. This right here would be the full build. This right here is a more budget-friendly approach to that build, should still do pretty fine in Steel Path though. And before we go on, let's also quickly talk about which companions would make sense on her. And when it comes to that, you're actually free to use whatever is fun to you. Ember doesn't require a specific companion as much as some other Warframes do. So yeah, Dirigar with his Arcoil Zap Zap status priming is always great. You could also go for a Panzervalpaphyla for that nice viral spread and viral priming. Nautilus to group up your enemies to benefit from that AoE effect from your flames could be a nice choice too, but I personally always feel like Nautilus is a bit inconsistent and unpredictable, so I don't like him that much. But if you love him, sure, go for him. And as I initially said, you could of course go for everything that is fun to you here. I personally went for the Panzervalpaphyla for the viral priming because that is really good. This right here, by the way, would be my Panzer build. And now, let's finally talk about which problem it is that I was talking about initially that Ember has that I feel kind of makes her a bit irrelevant in the game as it stands right now. Let's get into it. Now, the big problem that I see with Ember is that she fills a certain role that is being filled by a different Warframe out there, just that Warframe does all that Ember stands for, just a little bit better. So that in reality, if you wanted to have a frame that does exactly what Ember does, you kinda don't want to play Ember actually. See, when we think about what Ember actually does, what her main role in the game is, it's pretty straightforward, right? You have a very tanky frame with a lot of damage reduction, who can AoE armor strip, and with all her heat status effects, she also deals damage to the entire room, albeit not that high that you could really call her a quote-unquote nuke Warframe. This is the main thing that Ember does, and also kind of what her entire kit revolves around. And here is the kicker, because that entire kit, that entire specialization already exists in the game in the form of Gauss. When it comes to damage reduction, Gauss has his kinetic plating, which not only gives him 90% damage reduction, but up to 100% to all the damage types that you realistically care about, so that's technically even better than Ember. He can also AoE armor strip with his Thermal Sunder, but in contrast to Ember's Fireblast, you can spam that as much as you want because you don't need to wait for the meter to go up to 100%, and also Fireblast has some weird line of sight shenanigans going on where I feel that a lot of enemies that are very close to me when I cast it should realistically be armor stripped, but then in reality they aren't, so there's some weird stuff going on. And Thermal Sunder just doesn't care about line of sight at all, so that's in my opinion the better armor strip. And in terms of dealing damage to the entire room, yes, Ember has her heat, and yes, over time that heat will tick down the enemy health, but it's not that much. And, Gauss's Thermal Sunder, when you cast Thermal Sunder Cold, Thermal Sunder Heat, well, it just explodes the entire room. It deals so much AoE nuke damage, so in terms of damage output with their abilities, those two Warframes are in entirely different spheres, and as if that's not enough, Thermal Sunder also can AoE freeze the entire room, making you benefit from that new and increased crit damage bonus against frozen enemies. Now, you might say, Ember with her augment with the Fireball can infuse her weapons with heat damage. That is something that Gauss can't do, and that is true. But A, this is not that impactful if you ask me, And B, Gauss has other weapon buffs in his kit, like Fire Rate for example, so even though it's not that comparable, also Gauss definitely has his qualities as a weapons platform. So yeah, at the end of the day, if you look at it through the lens of Gauss, he kind of serves the same purpose that Ember serves. He can do all the main things that Ember can do as well, but if you ask me, he does all of that just that little bit better. Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that Ember is a bad Warframe. I mean, she's in an excellent spot in the game right now, but for all those players out there who are searching for a Warframe that serves Ember's purpose, I just wanted to make this video to inform you that you might also want to take a look at Gauss and if he might be the better option for you. And let's be real here for a second, once that Ember heirloom skin is out, there is, let's just say, enough reason to choose her over Gauss. But yeah, how do you feel about this whole thing, Gauss versus Ember? Let me know in the comments down below, would be really curious to read what you think about it, but please, as always, try to keep it civil. But just like Ember, also Frost has been reworked and he's in a much better spot than her if you ask me. So if you want to know how to turn him into a Harrow-like crit beast, then definitely check out this Frost guide right here. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Lycran Shepherd, Turtlepeer, Pepperwolf, Ondakanio2, Misfire DX, Streamjet21, Signup King 5000, Griblib Yixi, Mihawk HE, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, wish you a nice weekend, and until then, as always, good loot.